The forest was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that feels alive. Mist curled between the trees, soft and heavy, swallowing the faint trail beneath my boots. A pale light flickered somewhere ahead, like a lantern swaying with a slow, uneven rhythm. I remember stopping, just listening, letting the rustling leaves and distant hum of insects fill my ears. Every step I took seemed louder than the last, and my shadow stretched too long, twisting between the trees. I had been told stories. Strange creatures that walk on four legs, and yet sometimes mimic the shape of a human. I had laughed at them once, but as the fog thickened and a low, guttural sound drifted close, I felt the forest shift. Something was following me, something watching. My breath came slower, my heart louder. That's when I saw it. The pines whispered. Their needles pressed softly under my feet, dry and brittle. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, of something rotting just out of sight. A wind wound through the branches, carrying a sound that shouldn't have been there. It was a voice, mine, or maybe someone else's, repeating, soft, curling around the trunks. Shadows bent in impossible ways. One stretched long across the trail. Another seemed to slither between trees. I paused, breath catching, listening to the forest breathe with me. The mist began to rise, pale, curling at my ankles, climbing higher, brushing against my skin like cold fingers. I could feel it seep into my clothes, cling to my hair, dampen my eyelashes. Each step felt heavier, though the path stayed narrow and the needles soft. Still I felt eyes, counting me, following every subtle shift. The wind whispered my name again. Closer, behind me, a rustling off the trail made me stop entirely. Heart hammering, lungs tight. I barely dared to turn. Nothing moved at first. Then the shadows shifted in a way that made my stomach twist. The clearing opened slowly. The trees stepped back as if giving way to something unseen. The mist thinned and the whispers faded. Almost peaceful. Almost. At the edge, where the forest began again, a figure waited. Still, silent, watching. The pale light barely caught the outline, but I felt it in the chest, in the hollow between my ribs. I wanted to run. I wanted to call out. But my voice had abandoned me, leaving only soft, panicked breaths. And yet I didn't move. The figure didn't blink. Or maybe it did. Or maybe it wasn't eyes at all. Just dark hollows, empty and patient. A branch snapped somewhere behind me. A static hum filled my ears. Or maybe it was inside my head. The mist curled around my legs again, colder now, sharper. I could taste it on my tongue, metallic and bitter. The forest held me there, suspended, each breath a tremor, each heartbeat a drum. Alone yet not alone. I realized then that the figure hadn't stepped forward. It had always been there, waiting at the edge of what I could see. I had walked right into it. Or maybe it had walked into me. The clearing stayed quiet. The air felt thick, sticky, as if the mist itself was listening. I could smell pine and something else, something older, something waiting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the figure faded. Not moving, not leaving, just dissolving into the shadows. Or maybe the shadows swallowed it. I stood there too long, unable to leave, unable to breathe fully. The trail behind me was empty, the whispers gone, but the chill lingered, curling in my chest, twisting my thoughts. The forest exhaled around me, soft, patient. The mist settled back to the earth, and somewhere, deep in the dark, a name lingered. Mine. I stepped forward. The needles whispered underfoot. The trees shivered, and I walked on. The forest waited. Damp earth pressed against my boots. Fallen moss clung to my fingers when I brushed it aside. A glow flickered ahead, soft, tentative. A lantern, swinging slowly in the distance. No one held it. The light trembled across the trunks, stretching shadows into shapes that weren't there. They leaned, twisted, and melted into fog at the edges of my vision. Each flicker drew patterns in the moss, patterns I didn't recognize. I stepped closer. My heartbeat thumped in my ears, loud and hollow. The smell of wet pine rose with each inhale. A faint metallic tang lingered beneath it, like iron on my tongue. The lantern moved. Or maybe I moved past it. I couldn't tell which was real. The ground beneath the glow revealed tracks. They weren't human. Too long, too narrow, clawed, unfamiliar, each indentation deep, pressing into moss like the forest itself had grown feet. I crouched, fingers brushing damp earth. The smell of metal grew stronger, sharp at the back of my throat. The tracks led forward, then stopped. The lantern vanished. No swing, no shadow, only the quiet. The air hummed. Static, almost. My breath came in shallow bursts, filling the silence with soft rhythm. The fog curled around my ankles, then climbed higher, wrapping me in damp folds. I leaned toward where it had been. The earth smelled of decay, of water pooling beneath fallen needles. I could feel a pulse in the moss, subtle and slow, like it was breathing beneath me. Soft footsteps, almost too faint to hear. I turned. Nothing. Only the lingering glow on wet bark. Fading. Only the hint of metal, like something dragged away unseen. The wind shifted. A rustle passed through the trees. A single branch tapped lightly against another, echoing in the stillness. I followed the trail the lantern had left. Each step pressed deep into the moss, leaving my own mark alongside the tracks I didn't understand. The forest seemed to lean closer, holding its breath. I imagined shapes moving in the fog, curved shadows, fleeting glimpses at the edge of vision. Something pale brushed against my shoulder. No wind, just cold and wet, heavy as a sigh. The path ended in another clearing. The lantern's light never returned. I could see only the black outlines of trees and the silver fog weaving through them. The metallic scent lingered, clinging to my skin, my hair, my clothes. It filled the space between my heartbeats. I stood still, listening, hearing the forest's quiet hum, the gentle scrape of unseen movement, the soft settling of mist. And then I realized I wasn't alone, not in the way the world expects, not with footsteps or shadow, but with attention. The forest held me in its gaze. Waiting, I exhaled slowly. The fog slipped through my fingers like smoke. The moss softened beneath my feet. The quiet stretched, heavy and patient. I walked on. The tracks remained. The scent lingered. And somewhere, deep in the dark, the lantern waited. The fog rolled in thick. It clung to my jacket, cold and damp. Every breath I took carried the scent of wet earth and pine. The trail disappeared beneath the white haze. Soft footsteps pressed into the moss, hesitant, uncertain. The leaves rustled around me, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. Each step felt heavy, as if the forest resented my presence, as if the fog itself was warning me to stop. I thought I saw movement. At first, just shadows shifting between the trees. Then something more. A figure darted across the pale light, limbs bent at impossible angles, scraping the moss and leaves. It paused, head tilted unnaturally, watching. I froze, heart thundering, cold fog wrapping tight around my shoulders, squeezing. The smell of wet bark mixed with something metallic, faint but sharp. Its gaze held me, not just looking, but studying, patient, curious. I wasn't sure if it even belonged to this world. The air felt alive. The rustling leaves grew louder, closer, almost pressing against my ears. I swallowed. The taste of damp iron lingered on my tongue. The fog moved with each breath, swirling around my boots. I wanted to move. I wanted to run. But my feet felt rooted to the moss, trapped. The figure twitched. A subtle shift in its posture, like a branch bending under a breeze. Then it darted again, slipping into the fog, vanished before I could take a step. Silence fell, thick and heavy. I could hear the forest breathing, the hum of unseen insects, the soft drip of condensation from pine needles. I followed the fading movement. Soft steps pressed into the damp ground, leaving no trace. The fog swallowed the trail, hiding what I could not name. Shadows bent and stretched as I passed. Something brushed my arm. No wind, just a cold, wet touch. I felt its presence behind me, waiting, patient. The forest seemed to shrink around me. Every tree closer, every branch sharper. Even the air felt thick, pressing against my chest. I stopped in a small clearing. The fog rolled across the ground like slow water. My breath puffed in pale clouds. The figure didn't return, but the forest's eyes remained, watching, silent. I exhaled slowly, tasting damp pine and iron. The rustling leaves fell quiet. The fog settled around my legs. I took another step forward. The trail opened slightly. Soft light touched the moss. The forest waited, and I walked on. The fog pressed closer. It wrapped around my jacket, damp and cold. The trail beneath my boots was soft with fallen needles, yet every step echoed too sharply. I heard footsteps, soft, gentle, matching mine exactly. I slowed. They slowed. I quickened. They quickened. A flush of panic rose in my chest. My breath became loud, harsh in the mist. The forest seemed to lean closer, holding its trees still, watching. The crunch of leaves filled my ears. Each step behind me pressed deeper into the damp earth. Yet when I spun around, nothing moved, only shadows curling beneath pale trunks. A snap of a twig startled me. I whirled again. Empty, the fog swallowed every shape, every branch, every trace of life. The footsteps didn't stop. They lingered, patient, just beyond the edge of sight. Cold air brushed my neck. I could smell wet moss and iron. My fingers grazed the bark of a nearby tree. Rough, damp, alive. I could feel the pulse of the forest beneath my palm. Steady, watchful. I moved faster. Soft steps pressed into the moss behind me. Closer, fainter. I couldn't tell. The fog thickened. Each breath I took formed pale clouds, dissolving before my eyes. The forest hummed quietly, the rustling leaves whispering in tandem with the footsteps. I paused. The mist curled around my boots, climbing higher, cold as a finger. I listened, heart hammering. The footsteps didn't move away. They didn't grow louder. They simply waited. I tilted my head. Something shifted in the corner of my vision. A shadow stretched, then melted into the fog. The smell of damp pine and faint metal hung in the air. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my breath. The trail stretched on, empty yet full of presence. I felt it behind me, close enough to brush my mind with its patience, its intent. The forest pressed in. Every tree seemed taller, darker, alive. The fog settled in thick folds around my shoulders. The footsteps echoed once more, soft and exact. I took another step. The moss gave slightly beneath my weight. The air smelled damp, cold, and metallic. The footsteps followed. I stopped. The fog curled around my legs, silent now. The trail ahead vanished into white. The forest waited, and so did it. I walked on. The steps stayed behind me, soft, persistent, always just beyond sight. The fog hung low, cold and damp against my cheeks. Each breath carried the scent of wet pine and earth, heavy with decay. A branch brushed my face, thin, damp, almost soft. It startled me, though I should have been used to the forest touch by now. That's when I saw them. Eyes, pale, unblinking. They hovered in the shadows, not moving. Yet I felt their gaze pierce through the fog, cutting deep, settling on my chest like a weight. My heartbeat quickened. Every blink stretched too long. Each time I opened my eyes again, they were gone. The fog felt thicker now, damp curling around my boots, my jacket, seeping into my hair. The forest seemed quieter, almost holding its breath. I could taste iron on my tongue. The damp bark under my fingers felt alive, pulsing, patient. Every shadow bent unnaturally, like the trees themselves were leaning toward me. I tried to look away, to shake the feeling, but the eyes returned, always there, just beyond the reach of sight. A soft hum lingered in the mist, static, almost imperceptible, vibrating along the back of my neck. I could hear my pulse echoing, loud, uneven. The forest and the fog pressed closer. I blinked again, and they were gone, leaving nothing but the echo of my own racing heartbeat. The cold dampness of the fog wrapping tighter around my shoulders. A rustle nearby made me turn. Empty. Shadows stretched, melted, but the eyes did not reappear. Still I felt them, watching, waiting. The smell of wet pine and metallic iron clung to the air. Each breath was thick, slow, sticky in my chest. The forest seemed to breathe with me. The fog whispered around my ankles, curling, patient. I walked forward, carefully, boots sinking softly into moss, leaves brushing against my knees. Every step felt like intrusion. Every step was measured against invisible eyes. The world shrank to fog and shadow. The hum continued, almost in tune with my heartbeat. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, the eyes lingered, not leaving, not moving. I exhaled slowly, cold air filling my lungs, carrying damp metallic scents. The fog rolled past my boots, soft and thick. The forest remained still, patient, alive. I could not see them anymore, but I could feel them, threading through the mist, waiting. I walked on, each step deliberate, careful. The fog clung, the forest breathed, and the eyes were always just beyond the reach of sight. The trail split before me, a fork I hadn't expected. The map in my hand felt suddenly useless, lines and markers meaningless in the shifting fog. The forest had changed. Branches bent at strange angles, some broken, others twisted unnaturally. Footprints pressed into the soft moss, then faded into mist. A smell lingered, wet, musky, like fur pressed against damp earth. It clung to the fog, subtle, impossible to ignore. The trees leaned closer, their trunks dark and rough under my fingertips. The fog curled around my boots, cold and damp, like it had a mind of its own. Each step felt like intrusion. The air tasted of iron and wet pine. A branch scraped my shoulder, soft but sharp. I followed the faint trail. Footprints that disappeared and reappeared, never consistent, never human. The forest seemed to bend around them, guiding me or warning me. Shadows stretched between the trunks. They moved just beyond vision, curling and twisting as I passed. A soft hum filled the fog, or perhaps it was my own pulse echoing back at me. I paused. The air felt heavier, the mist thicker. The smell of wet fur lingered, warmer now, closer. Something had been here, watching, waiting. The broken branches formed strange patterns on the ground. Some pointed forward. Some looped back toward where I had come. Every choice felt wrong, yet I couldn't stop walking. The forest closed in. Branches brushed my face, wet and cold. The ground sank slightly beneath my boots, soft and uneven. The fog pressed into my hair and jacket, folding around me. I could feel it. Eyes, not just behind the trunks, not just in the shadows, but in the very air, threading through the mist, pressing on my shoulders. The footprints vanished again. Only the broken trail remained. Silent, waiting. I exhaled, tasting damp moss and iron. The hum of the forest seemed to pulse with my heartbeat. Every rustle, every sigh of wind made the hairs on my neck stand. I took another step. The fog swirled around my boots. The forest leaned closer, every tree dark and patient, every shadow curling toward me. The trail offered no answers, only questions, only unease, and the feeling that I was not alone. I walked on. The broken trail led forward, footprints gone, branches twisted, the forest watching, and I followed, silent, careful, unsettled. The wind carried a low howl, human-like, yet impossibly wrong. It curled through the trunks, rattling the moss, brushing cold fog against my cheeks. I followed it, soft steps pressing into wet needles. Branches scraped my shoulders, damp and rough. The air smelled of earth, of pine, of something faintly metallic lurking beneath. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, curving along fallen logs, stretching across moss like dark water. Every flicker of pale light revealed shapes that dissolved before I could name them. I stopped at a fallen log, its surface slick with moss and rain. The howl rolled again, closer, twisting through the fog. I held my breath, tried to trace it with my eyes. The forest seemed to bend, leaning inward, holding its darkness still. Then silence, thick, heavy, pressing in. The fog wrapped around my legs, wet and patient. A low growl pressed into the back of my neck. Soft, deliberate, almost a whisper. Don't look. The words slid over my skin, cold and wet. I could taste iron in the air. The forest breathed around me, patient, waiting. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I imagined movement at the edges of the fog, curved shadows, fleeting glimpses between trunks. The moss felt slippery beneath my boots. Every step seemed to echo in the quiet. I could feel eyes following, threading through the fog, patient and heavy. The howl rolled again, distant now, curling around the trees. The fog swirled in slow spirals, brushing my hair, chilling my neck. Branches creaked softly, leaning closer. I exhaled slowly. The growl lingered, teasing the fog, teasing my mind. The forest smelled damp, pine and earth mixed with a faint metallic tang that had followed me. I couldn't see it. Not really. Only shadows, only the suggestion of limbs bending unnaturally. Only the echo of the whisper. I moved along the log, boots pressing into soft moss, hands brushing bark. Each step deliberate, careful, measured. The howl faded. The whisper faded. The forest waited, patient, silent, alive. I could feel it watching still. Just beyond reach, just beyond sight. The fog curling at my feet, soft and cold. Holding me in place. I stepped forward. The path stretched, wet and dark. Shadows shifted, brushing the edges of vision. And I walked on, alone. The fog pressed thick against my face. Cold and damp. Curling through my hair, slipping into my jacket. The forest smelled of wet pine and earth, heavy with the metallic tang that had followed me. Pale footprints emerged from a mist. Not human, not entirely animal. Long, narrow, clawed in some places, soft and rounded in others. They twisted through the forest, curving between trunks, over roots slick with moss. I felt compelled to follow, compelled by something I could not name. The fog shifted with each step. Branches brushed my arms, wet and rough. Leaves bent unnaturally as I passed over them, pressing back down once my weight left. Every step felt like a trap. Every pause stretched into an eternity. The forest hummed quietly, patient and alive. I followed the trail deeper. Shadows moved in ways that did not match the light. The mist curled around my legs, damp and insistent. I could taste ire in the air, sharp on my tongue. The footprints bent left, then right, then vanished briefly under a tangle of roots. I bent close, tracing with my fingers, feeling the damp moss, cold and yielding. When I looked up, they had reappeared, leading onward. The forest closed around me. Branches scraped my shoulders. The fog wrapped tighter, heavy and soft at the same time. I could hear my pulse echoing in the quiet, slow and unsteady. The trail led over a fallen log, slick with moss. Each step over made the footprints appear again, like they were guiding me, or watching me. Every shadow seemed to lean closer, patient, waiting. I stepped carefully, boots pressing into soft, wet earth. The fog hissed along the moss, a rustling whisper behind me. But when I turned, nothing was there. I continued. The footprints twisted ahead, bending at impossible angles, curving around trees that seemed too tall, too close. I felt eyes pressing through the mist, patient and unseen. Then they disappeared. The trail ended abruptly, as if swallowed by the fog itself. The forest smelled damp and cold. The metallic tang lingered, sharper now, closer. I stood still, listening, hearing the soft settling of leaves, the hiss of mist curling around my boots, the subtle hum threading through the forest. The footprints were gone, yet the forest seemed aware of my presence. Patient, watching, waiting. I exhaled slowly. The fog clung to my legs, soft and damp. The shadows stretched, shifting imperceptibly, and I walked on. The fog pressed against my face, cold and damp. The trail beneath my boots was slick with moss and fallen needles. The air smelled of wet pine, iron, and something faintly electric. A shadow flickered across the path. It moved against the pale light, bending around trunks, stretching across the moss. I caught glimpses, limbs that seemed wrong, joints twisted, angles impossible. A face appeared briefly, stretched, malformed, eyes too wide, too dark, watching. I tried call out. My voice felt swallowed by the fog. It dissolved before it left my throat. The mist curled around my ankles, damp and heavy. Branches brushed my shoulders, wet and rough. The shadows shifted just beyond reach, patient, waiting. I froze, heart hammering. The forest hummed quietly, or maybe it was in my chest. Every breath thick with damp and metallic tang. It flickered again, closer, then vanished behind a tree, leaving the air still and tight. The ground beneath my boots felt softer, like it was pressing back, Leaves bent unnaturally. The fog wove between my legs, wrapping me in quiet pressure. I could feel it, watching me from just beyond the light. The forest held its breath. The air pulsed with anticipation, cold and wet. I took a step forward. The shadow flickered, limbs stretched impossibly, face twisted. A faint static hummed along my skin, prickling at the back of my neck. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was there, always there, just at the edge of sight. The fog thickened. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth. Branches scraped my jacket. The smell of wet moss and iron hung heavily in the air. Another flicker, then silence. The shadow gone. Only the echo of my heartbeat and the hum of damp, living forest. I exhaled slowly. Cold air filled my lungs. The trail stretched ahead, dark and empty. The fog swirled around my legs, patient, watching. I walked on, each step deliberate, careful, aware. The shadow was always just beyond reach. Waiting. The fog clung to the forest floor, cold and damp, curling around my boots. The air smelled of wet pine, earth, and something faintly metallic, sharp under my nose. A tree hollow glowed faintly ahead, soft, pale light spilling from the dark rim. I approached slowly, heart tight, every breath shallow. The bark was rough under my fingertips. Scratches rimmed the hollow, jagged, deliberate. Something had been here before me. I peered inside. Darkness swallowed the light. Nothing, or so I thought. A pair of eyes reflected my flashlight, bright, unblinking, then gone. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every leaf frozen, every branch still. I realized my own footsteps had stopped entirely. No soft press of boots in moss, no crunch of leaves, only the fog swirling around my legs. The hollow seemed to pulse. A faint hum threaded through the air, low and insistent. The smell of damp earth intensified, mixing with the metallic tang I couldn't shake. I stepped closer. The tree felt alive, waiting. My hand hovered at the rim. The eyes could appear again at any moment. The fog pressed in tighter. Branches scratched against my jacket. Cold settled into my shoulders. The forest was silent, patient, watching. I blinked. The eyes were gone. But I felt them still there, threading through the hollow, pressing at the edge of sight. The light from the hollow flickered faintly. Shadows bent inside, twisting impossibly. The air felt electric, damp, alive. Every inhale tasted of wet bark and iron. I exhaled slowly. The hum continued, soft and low, threading through the fog. The forest leaned in. I was not alone. I stepped back, boots pressed into soft moss. Branches scraped against my arms. The hollow waited, patient. Still, I could feel it, watching. Every pulse of the forest in rhythm with my own heartbeat. Every shadow stretched closer, patient, aware. The fog curled around my legs. The pale light flickered once more, then faded. I walked on, footsteps returning softly beneath my boots. The hollow remained behind me, dark, silent, alive. And the forest held its breath. The fog hung heavy, cold, damp, curling around my boots and jacket. The forest smelled of wet pine and earth, sharp and lingering. A low hum filled the trees. It vibrated in my chest, soft, steady, almost soothing. But wrong. It didn't belong here. I followed it, soft steps pressing into moss and fallen needles. Branches scraped my arms, damp and rough. The hum wrapped around me, pulling me deeper into the fog. Shapes moved just beyond sight, limbs bending too far, shadows merging, stretching, twisting. The pale light flickered against trunks, revealing angles that felt unnatural. The hum rose, louder now, echoing, pressing against my ribs. I could feel it in the soles of my boots, vibrating along the ground. The fog thickened. Every inhale tasted of wet bark and iron. The air felt electric, heavy, alive. The shadows shifted, almost sentient, just at the edge of vision. I stepped carefully. Soft footsteps on moss, leaves brushing my knees. The hum thrummed louder, vibrating in my skull. It was beautiful, terrifying. Then silence, abrupt. The fog seemed to pause, curling at my ankles, waiting. The forest held its breath. I stood still. Cold seeped into my jacket. my hair damp against my neck. Every shadow leaned closer, patient, patient. The hum returned faintly, fading in and out like a distant memory. Shapes twitched in the fog. Limbs bent impossibly. The forest pulsed with quiet anticipation. I exhaled slowly, tasting damp pine and metallic tang. The ground beneath my boots felt soft, yielding alive. I stepped forward. The fog swirled around my legs. Shadows curled between trunks, just out of reach. The hum echoed softly, then vanished. Silence settled, thick, patient, pressing in. The forest waited, and I walked on. The fog clung to the underbrush, cold and damp, curling around my boots and jacket. The forest smelled of wet pine, earth, and something sharp I couldn't name. A flash of white caught my eye. Teeth, too many, gleaming in the dim light. I froze. A creature crouched there, just beyond the ferns. Eyes dark, limbs folded tight. It stared at me, then vanished, faster than a blink, leaving only the damp fog and the whisper of leaves settling. My hands shook, cold, damp air pressed into my sleeves. The forest seemed aware of me, watching, patient, waiting. The ground beneath my boots felt soft, yielding, alive. Branches scraped my shoulders, wet and rough. Every rustle sounded like movement just beyond reach. I stepped forward carefully, soft footsteps pressing into moss. The smell of damp earth and metallic tang clung to the air. The shadows bent, curling just out of sight. Another flash, a glint of teeth, sharp and white, reflected in the faint light. It crouched, watching, patient, waiting, then gone. The forest hummed softly, a vibration through the roots, the soil, the air. I could feel it in my chest, threading through my bones. The fog curled at my ankles, damp and thick. Every step felt measured, deliberate. The creature could return at any moment. The shadows bent. The leaves whispered. I held my breath, tasting damp moss and iron on my tongue. The hum of the forest wrapped around me, low and patient. I realized my heartbeat echoed in my ears. The forest leaned closer, alive, aware. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Every rustle, every sigh of fog pressed against my skin. I exhaled slowly. The glint of teeth was gone. Only the memory lingered, and the forest waiting, patient, alive. I walked on, boots pressing into soft moss. Fog curling around my legs. Shadows bending, twisting. The forest aware of every step. The fog pressed low over the forest floor, cold and damp, curling around my boots. The scent of wet pine and charred would fill the air. I came across a campsite. Abandoned, logs blackened, a tent torn open, supplies left scattered, as the owners had vanished mid-step. The fire pit flickered, pale flame dancing, though no one was there. Its warmth touched my fingers, brief and unnatural, then vanished. Shadows moved like smoke, curving and curling around the edges of the clearing. The fog twisted, following them, thick and insistent. A low hiss whispered through the pines. Soft, deliberate, it slid along the ground, brushing against my ankles, weaving through the trees. I stepped closer, soft moss pressing under my boots. Branches scraped my arms, damp and rough. The forest smelled of wet earth and iron. The feeling of being watched never left. Eyes threading through the fog, just beyond reach. Shadows bending toward me, patient, patient. The tent flapped lightly, torn edges moving against nothing. The fire flickered again, brief pale light, reflecting on damp leaves. I could hear the faint settling of branches. I crouched beside the logs, charred and blackened, still warm, still alive. The hum of the forest threaded through the mist, vibrating softly in my chest. A branch cracked behind me. I turned. Nothing, but the feeling of presence lingered, heavier than fog, heavier than the night. The shadows swirled in the clearing, curving along the ground, climbing the trunks. The pale flame flickered once more, then disappeared. I exhaled slowly. The campsite was empty again. Only the smell of wet pine and smoke remained. I stepped back, boots pressing into soft moss. The fog curling at my legs, cold and patient. The forest held its breath, and I walked on. The fog pressed close, cold and damp. It curled around my boots, slipping into my jacket, brushing my neck. The forest smelled of wet pine and earth, sharp, metallic, alive. A chill ran along my neck. I exhaled, and my breath mingled with something colder. It brushed against my face, almost human, almost aware. Shapes formed in the fog. They looked human at first glance, then twisted, grotesque. Limbs bent wrong, angles impossible. The pale mist wrapped around them, soft and suffocating. I ran, boots pressing into moss, crunching leaves beneath. Branches scraped my arms, wet and rough. The fog swirled, curling at my legs, thick and insistent. Something breathed behind me, step for step, matching mine. Low, wet, patient. Each exhale mirrored mine, cold and sharp. The forest seemed alive. Every shadow stretched toward me. The fog pulsed with presence, heavy and unrelenting. The smell of damp earth and metallic tang pressed into my lungs. I glanced back. Shapes twisted in the mist, impossible angles, faces stretched. The cold breath followed, pressing along my neck, curling into my hair. I could feel it brushing against my skin. I stumbled. Soft boots pressed into moss, slipping slightly. The breathing echoed mine. Closer now, patient, deliberate. The fog thickened. Branches scraped my shoulders, wet and rough. The shapes swirled, bending toward me, patient, aware. Each step forward was met with mirrored breath, mirrored presence. I exhaled slowly, tasting damp pine iron cold. The forest hummed softly, alive. Threading through the mist, the shapes lingered just beyond sight. I walked on, footsteps pressing softly into moss. Fog curling around my legs, wrapping me. The breath remained patient just behind. The forest held its breath. The fog pressed low over the trail, cold and damp, curling around my boots. The forest smelled of wet pine and earth, heavy and still. A lantern lay shattered on the ground. Glass cracked, edges sharp, flame flickering weakly. Its light wavered, casting pale shadows across the moss. I bent to pick it up. The warmth of the weak flame brushed my fingers. Cold seeped from the broken glass into my palms. As I straightened, I saw it. A figure crouched at the edge of the trail. Unnaturally still, head tilted inhumanly. I blinked. The forest held its breath. When my eyes opened again, it was gone. Only shadows remained. Mist curling between the trunks, thick and insistent. The pale light of the lantern danced over wet leaves and moss. I stepped carefully, boots pressing softly into the ground. Branches scraped my shoulders, damp and rough. The smell of wet pine and earth pressed in, sharp and alive. The lantern flickered again. Shadows bent across the trail, twisting along roots. The forest seemed to lean closer, patient, aware. I exhaled slowly, every breath thick with fog and metallic tang. The figure might return at any moment. The mist pulsed around my legs, heavy and insistent. I held the lantern higher. Its weak light trembled against the trunks and leaves. Silence pressed in. Soft footsteps of my own boots echoed unnaturally loud. I glanced back. The trail behind me was empty, only fog and shadows. The forest watched. I walked on, lantern in hand, flame flickering softly, fog curling around my legs. Shadows bending, patient, distant. The forest held its breath. The fog lay thick, curling around tree trunks and fallen leaves. Cold settled into my jacket, damp seeping into my hair. The forest smelled of wet pine, earth, and something metallic, faint but sharp. A scream carried through the trees. Distant, sharp, impossible to place. Not human entirely, more like a cry from something trapped. I followed it, soft boots pressed into moss, over roots and fallen limbs. Branches scraped my arms, damp and rough. The fog curled around my legs, heavy, insistent. Each step brought me closer. The scream twisted in the fog, bending and stretching. It became a laugh. High, hollow, unnatural, then vanished, leaving silence thick and pressing. I stopped. The forest held its breath. Shadows leaned from every angle, patient, aware. The faint scent of wet pine and iron pressed into my nostrils. I moved again, step by careful step, over roots and moss. Branches brushed my shoulders, damp and sharp. The fog coiled around me, soft, suffocating. The scream returned, faint and twisted. Each approach bent it into something else. A cry, a laugh, a whisper curling along the trees. It echoed along the fog, vibrating in my chest. The forest seemed alive. Shadows bent, stretching toward me. Branches scraped wet against my jacket. The air smelled of moss and decay, sharp and close. I exhaled slowly. The scream twisted again, then vanished entirely. Only the whisper of fog remained, heavy and patient. The forest leaned in. I walked on, soft footsteps pressing into moss. Branches scraping, fog curling around my legs. Shadows stretching, twisting, waiting. The air hummed quietly, alive with unseen presence. And the scream lingered in memory. Faint but sharp, an echo that might return, patient, waiting, just beyond sight. The mist lay thick over the trail. It clung to my jacket, damp and cold. The forest smelled of wet pine and earth, heavy, alive. Every sound I made echoed unnaturally. My own voice returned, distorted, mocking. Soft, stretched, like it belonged to someone else. I stepped carefully, boots pressing into moss, over roots and fallen leaves. Branches scraped my shoulders, wet and rough. The mist curled around my legs, thick, insistent. Shapes moved in the periphery, always just out of focus. Limbs bent at impossible angles. Eyes reflected pale light, then vanished. The forest felt aware. Shadows leaned toward me, patient, patient. The air pressed cold against my cheeks. The smell of damp moss and iron lingered, sharp. I whispered a name. It returned, stretched and hollow, mocking, impossible. My breath mingled with the mist, curling around my face. Step after careful step, I moved forward. The trail twisted beneath my feet. Fog thickened, blurring tree trunks and leaves. Branches pressed into my arms, damp and rough. Each step echoed louder, mirrored by the forest itself. The shapes followed, bending with the mist. I could feel them, patient, watching. Shadows press along the ground, curling at roots and logs. Every sound I made returned twisted, unnatural, echoing the fog that I exhaled slowly. The forest hummed softly, alive with presence. The shapes remained just beyond vision, patient, waiting. Every echo mocked my heartbeat, my breath, my steps. I walked on, boots pressing softly into moss. Fog curling around my legs. Shadows bending, patient, distant. The trail held its breath, and the echoes followed, soft, hollow, impossible to ignore. The forest stretched, waiting, alive. The forest thinned at the edge of the creek. Water trickled over rocks, cold and clear. Mist curled along the surface, curling into the trees. I knelt to drink. The cool water pressed against my lips, smooth and sharp. A sudden ripple caught my eye. Shadows moved beneath the surface. Slow, deliberate, impossible place. Faces appeared, too many, pressed against the water's edge. Eyes pale, unblinking, mouth silent. I blinked. They were gone. Only ripples remained, echoing outward. The forest grew silent, heavy, expectant, as if holding its breath. The scent of wet earth and moss pressed close, thick and damp. I reached for the water again. Ripples moved ahead of my hand. A flash of teeth, or maybe just shadow, vanished before I could see clearly. The creek whispered along the rocks. Branches bent low, fog curling around my legs. The air felt colder here, heavier, pressing into my chest. I stayed kneeling, heart slow, careful. Every small sound echoed in the creek's hush. A fallen leaf floated by, trembling as if alive. Shadows stretched along the water, patient, watching. I exhaled, fog mingling with my breath. The faces might return, or perhaps they were already gone. The forest pressed around me, quiet, alive. I stepped back slowly, boots pressing into soft earth, water brushing my ankles. Branches scratched wet against my jacket. The fog shifted with each movement. The creek ran clear again. No faces, no ripples out of place. Only the hum of the forest, low and distant. Still, the sense of being watched lingered, patient and waiting. I stood fully. Lantern light danced across the fog, pale and trembling. The creek whispered beneath my feet, alive, secret. The forest leaned closer, silent and knowing, and I moved on, every step careful, soft. As the shadows followed along the water's edge, the forest held its breath. The creek kept its secrets. The forest thinned suddenly. Mist curled low along the ground, wet and soft against my ankles. I stepped into a clearing bathed in pale, frosted light. The frost glowed faintly. It wasn't cold, but the air felt heavy, expectant. Footprints appeared before my eyes, delicate, then vanished. The earth seemed to reject them, swallowing every mark. I stepped slowly, boots pressing softly into moss and frost. The fog curled around my legs, thick, insistent. Leaves whispered underfoot, dry and brittle. In the center of the clearing, a figure crouched, head low, shoulders tense, still as stone. The frost around it shimmered in faint light. I held my breath. The figure raised its eyes. They glimmered like glass, pale and liquid, catching the faint light, and then they melted back into shadow. The clearing pulsed with silence. No rustle, no hum, just the soft tick of my heartbeat. The frost seemed to sway, though the air was still. I could smell wet earth, moss, and a faint metallic tang lingering in the fog. I moved a step closer. Shadows twisted along the edges of my vision. The figure crouched deeper, melding with the frost. Every footstep I took vanished, leaving no mark. The forest leaned inward, patient, watching. The air pressed against my skin, thick with anticipation. The frost beneath my hands felt almost alive, cold but pulsing faintly. The figure remained crouched, waiting, patient, unreadable. I whispered to myself, soft, careful. The words echoed back strangely, stretched and hollow. My own breath mingled with the fog, curling toward the figure. Its eyes shimmered faintly again, then vanished entirely. I exhaled slowly. The clearing seemed empty, yet alive, humming beneath the frost. Every shadow leaned closer, patient and quiet. The footprints were gone. Nothing remained but the soft glimmer of frost in the pale light. I stepped back toward the forest. Fog curled around me, brushing my cheeks and hands. Branches scratched wet against my jacket. Pressing close, the clearing stayed behind me, frozen, expectant, holding its breath. And I moved on, every soft footstep swallowed by the mist, every shadow lingering just beyond sight. The frost held its secrets. The forest remained alive and waiting. The forest pressed close around me. Twilight filtered through damp leaves, pale and static. Mist curled along the roots and moss, curling against my ankles. A hum rose from the depths, low, steady, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. It wasn't music. It wasn't wind. It was something alive. I tried to walk away. Boots sank softly into wet moss. Branches brushed my face. Every step felt heavier, slower, like the forest itself resisted my movement. Shadows flickered unnaturally. They bent around the trunks, twisting against logic. I shivered. The air smelled of damp earth, moss, and something metallic, faint but sharp. The hum deepened. It trembled through the trees, resonating with every leaf. It became a voice, low and almost recognizable, whispering words I almost understood. I leaned closer, breath foggy in the cold air. The words tickled the edges of my mind. I stepped backward. The forest floor felt soft and wet beneath me, yet unyielding. The shadows stretched longer, curling toward me. Every movement echoed in the fog, my own breathing sharp and loud. The hum became insistent, a rhythm that pulsed through my chest and fingertips. I tried to call out. My voice tangled in the fog, swallowed before it left my throat. The whispering words slipped away, just out of reach, leaving a hollow emptiness. Silence followed. The fog thickened, pressing against my skin. The forest seemed to pause, waiting. Even the soft rustling of leaves stilled. I felt alone, and yet watched. I took a careful step forward. The ground smelled of wet earth, of decay, and of something older, something patient. The hum had vanished, but its absence vibrated in my chest. A silence, so complete it seemed to press into my ears. Shadows leaned into the fog. Branches hovered in the periphery. Every footstep left no mark. Every breath sounded impossibly loud. I exhaled slowly. The mist curled along my legs. The forest held its breath, unblinking. The hollow hum lingered only in memory, echoing faintly beneath my skin. And I moved on, step by slow step, through the fog, through the silent trees. The forest remained, alive, patient, whispering just beneath the edge of hearing. The trail stretched ahead, pale light filtering through mist-laden trees. Each step pressed softly into moss and wet leaves. The air smelled of cold earth and damp bark. I noticed the path bending. Not naturally, not gently. It twisted, doubling back on itself. Landmarks I recognized gone. Shadows clung to the trunks, shifting, slipping just beyond the edge of vision. They moved with a slowness that made the fog seem alive. A rustle whispered, brushing against my ears, but no branch stirred. The fog thickened. It coiled around my ankles, curling into my jacket. Every step echoed louder than it should have. I felt my chest tighten, my breath quick, harsh. A low growl rolled through the mist, deep, distant, and yet pressing close. It carried a weight like the forest itself exhaling. I froze. The sound lingered, vibrating to the cold air, unsettling the silence. I tried to turn back. The path behind me, different, the same trees warped, trunks leaning at impossible angles. The trail I knew no longer existed. Shadows leaned closer, limbs stretched in the corners of vision. The forest smelled faintly metallic now, like something waiting. The moss underfoot was soft, but each step felt trapped, reluctant. I whispered to myself, words muffled by fog. The growl returned, lower now, rumbling through the mist. It circled, rolling from tree to tree, as if following the rhythm of my heartbeat. I stumbled over a root, hands brushing cold earth. The fog shifted. Shapes moved just beyond reach, twisting like smoke in moonlight. The forest seemed patient, watching, holding its breath. The path bent again, impossible angles, doubling back with no logic. My own footsteps sounded alien in the silence. Every turn felt like leaving the world I knew further behind. Even the air felt thicker, tasting faintly of iron. I tried to call out, a soft murmur. The echo returned, distorted, mocking, unrecognizable. Shadows flickered across the trunks, lingering, then vanishing. A chill crawled up my neck, hair standing in alert silence. I moved cautiously, senses sharpened. Every leaf, every drip of moisture against bark, louder, nearer. The growl rolled again, then cut abruptly. The forest waited. I realized I was no longer on the trail I knew. The fog thickened like a wall. Shadows clung to the trees, moving just out of reach. The path ahead uncertain, and I stepped forward, slowly, through twisted trunks and mist that pressed against my skin. Every movement felt like intrusion. Every breath echoed in the hollow quiet. The forest remained patient. Shadows stretching, twisting. The fog curling. The growl distant but lingering in my chest. The twisted path swallowing each step, holding its secrets. And I followed. The fog pressed thick between the trees. Twilight made everything pale, shapes muted in mist. The air smelled of wet bark and something faintly metallic. I brushed against a tree. Cold. A hand, pale, human, impossibly long. I spun. Nothing. Leaves shivered in the quiet, mimicking the motion of my arms. The forest seemed aware. Rustling whisper like breath. Shadows moved just beyond the reach of pale light. Each step I took, the earth felt softer, hesitant, almost holding me. My heart thumped in my chest. The hum of the mist filled my ears. Every shadow flickered, curling like smoke. I reached forward, touching bark. Cold, slick, and again, hands brushing past, impossibly thin, brushing fingertips along my sleeve. I whispered, but the words were swallowed by fog. The rustling grew, closer, bending shapes into my own. Every leaf, every branch seemed to copy me. The forest was mocking, imitating my movements in the pale gloom. I stepped back, crunching wet leaves. The echo sounded wrong, longer, distorted, as though it were not my footfalls, but something else following the same rhythm. The air chilled, brushing the back of my neck. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes, tracing me through the fog. A soft breath tickled my ear, gone before I could notice. I turned slowly. The mist shifted, curling like fingers, A shadow leaned, stretching across the path, then vanished. The ground beneath me was damp, cold, unyielding. Every branch that snapped underfoot whispered in reply. I tried to move, but the air felt heavy, thickening around my limbs. Another brush against the tree. Hands. Cold human. Too long. I froze. The fog seemed to sigh, carrying whispers I almost understood. Shapes twisted in the periphery, leaves bending unnaturally. They mimicked me, mirrored me, but moved in ways that were wrong. I breathed slowly, trying to calm the tightness in my chest. Every exhale met something colder, something watching. Shadows coiled around trunks, stretching and folding back into themselves. I took a step, then another. The forest followed. Every movement copied. Every pause echoed, mirrored, mocked. The rustling softened. Hands brushed the bark one last time. The fog shifted, hiding what lay beyond, keeping secrets pressed in silence. I moved forward, careful. The pale light softened, mist curling over roots and rocks. Leaves settled back into stillness. For a moment, only my own breath remained, echoing softly against the damp earth. The forest remained alive, silent, watching. And I walked, step by step, knowing the hands had only retreated for now. Mist curled at my feet. Every step I took sank softly into damp earth. The forest smelled of wet moss and something iron-like. I tried to retrace my path, but the trail had vanished. Footprints I knew were gone. The fog thickened, clinging to my ankles. It whispered over roots, over fallen leaves. Silence pressed close, heavy and still. A pale shape lingered in the distance, silent, watching. I stopped, held my breath. The air felt thicker, colder against my skin. Rustling leaves answered me, yet no wind stirred. Each exhale met the fog, curling around my face. Was it mine or theirs? I moved forward cautiously. Shadows draped over trunks, stretching unnaturally. Every branch seemed to lean closer, eager to see. The shape followed, always pale, always distant, just beyond recognition. My heart pounded, and the sound didn't belong entirely to me. Mist swirled higher, brushing my cheeks and lips. The smell of wet earth was stronger, heavier, almost choking. A static hum vibrated in the air, faint but insistent. I reached for a tree, fingers slick with damp bark. The fog shimmered around my hands. Shadows twisted where light failed to reach. Footsteps, my own, echoed strangely. Then nothing. Each footfall left no mark. The forest seemed to swallow my passage. The pale figure shifted. Closer now. I could feel a gaze, piercing, cold, unblinking. No wind, no rustle, just that presence following. I tried calling out. Only a rasp left my throat. It dissolved in the fog. A branch snapped. I whirled. Nothing moved, but the shape remained pale, patient. The earth beneath me seemed soft, pliable, untrustworthy. Roots rose like fingers, then sank back into mist. Every inhale felt heavy, every step uncertain. The fog reached my knees, then my waist. Shapes coalesced just beyond my vision. Limbs bent wrong, leaves drifting upward. The figure mirrored my path, though I could not see it clearly. I slowed. Breath quickened. Mist clung to my skin, cold and wet. The forest held its breath with me. I stopped completely. The world was silent, but for my own heartbeat. Then I noticed the faintest shift. The shape was gone. The trail remained lost. No footprints, no marks, only fog and shadows. I was alone, but I wasn't. Step by step, I moved forward. Every motion felt measured, echoed by the forest itself. And the feeling never left. That eyes watched, just beyond reach. That presence followed, silent and patient, that my path was no longer my own. Fog clung to the trees. The night was thick, almost liquid. Branches dripped with moisture, slick against my hands. I glimpsed something above, limbs too long, bending in impossible angles. A body that didn't belong to the world I knew. Eyes glinted down at me, cold, pale, patient. I froze. The forest held its breath. Every rustle, every whisper of leaves felt deliberate. The fog wrapped around my ankles like soft chains. Then it dropped, silent, almost reverent. The mist swallowed it, and for a heartbeat, it was gone. Something shifted at the edge of my vision, movement all around, circling me. I could feel it more than see it. Shadows slithering between trunks, a static hum vibrating faintly through the damp air. My own breath became loud. Every inhale, every exhale measured and heavy. I tried to step forward. The forest resisted. The ground felt sticky, untrustworthy. Leaves brushed my arms. Twigs tapped softly against my shoulders. It was everywhere, yet nowhere. Eyes returned briefly, catching the pale light, watching, following. I stopped completely, held my heartbeat in my chest. The fog swirled, bending light, bending sound. Something moved closer. I didn't look. I couldn't. Shadows pressed nearer, folding over themselves. The forest became a presence, alive, knowing, patient. A breath passed over my neck, colder than the fog, sharper than the damp. I spun slowly. Nothing there. And then I realized I had been watched. From above, from every direction. The treetops were alive. Branches bent impossibly. Leaves shimmered like pale eyes. I tried to run. The fog resisted. Every step echoed, but led nowhere. The shape dropped again, vanishing into mist. Silence. Yet I felt it circling, always circling. I sank to the ground, arms around my knees. The forest loomed, alive, waiting. A whisper of movement passed just beyond reach. And I knew I was not alone, not ever alone. The night was thick, the fog heavy and wet. The air smelled of damp earth and moss. Breath puffed in front of me, white against the pale darkness. A lantern burned in the distance. Alone, small, flickering. It seemed to hum faintly, as if alive. I stepped forward. The ground soft, giving under my feet. Twigs bent, rustling like whispers around me. The lantern drew me closer. Its light trembled against the mist. I could feel it watching me, waiting, closer. The fog parted reluctantly, each step heavier than the last, dragging against some unseen weight. I reached the lantern. It stood on bare earth, the flame steady now, stubborn. Inside, nothing. Silence. A shadow flickered behind it. Quick, impossible to follow. I caught only the edge of movement, a dark shape bending against logic. The forest around me seemed to lean in. Branches stretched, twisting unnaturally. Leaves brushed against my arms, soft, deliberate. The hum rose slightly. Low, static in my chest. It wasn't from the lantern. It was the forest itself, vibrating, breathing. I realized then, the forest had been waiting all along. Every step, every misstep, every turn watched. I turned to leave. The path I had walked was gone. Mist swallowed it. Nothing remained but uncertainty. The lantern flickered. I stared at it. Its light threw shadows and impossible shapes across the fog. Soft footsteps seemed to echo behind me. But no one was there. The air pressed against me, heavy with expectation. I took a tentative step back. The lantern seemed to pulse with each inhale. A faint smell of smoke, dry and acrid, touched my nose. The hum deepened, resonating in my chest. I felt roots below me, unseen, shifting slightly. The forest was alive in a way I could feel in every bone. I stopped, held my breath. The shadows folded inward, almost playful, almost knowing. The lantern trembled. The flame stretched, bent, as though leaning toward me. I realized the light wasn't just light. It was a signal. And then, stillness. The hum vanished. The shadow vanished. The forest waited. I understood, in the quiet, in the cold weight of fog and earth. There was no path back. There was only here. I stood, watching the lantern. The flame small, stubborn, beautiful against the dark. Alone, the forest exhaled around me. Leaves whispered. Branches groaned softly. And I finally stopped moving. The lantern flickered once more. Then it burned steadily, waiting,